Welcome to ABA Inside Track's preview of our summer 2023 book club. You're getting this in the free feed because you subscribed to the show, and it's going to be just a snippet of our book club discussion of Walden Two. If this is your first preview listening to the show, every season we let listeners who subscribe to us on our Patreon page, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, vote on a book that they would like to hear us discuss. We discuss the book for 2 hours. Patrons are able to get 2 CEs for their patronage as a big thank you. And then about a year later, for folks who are not interested in joining us on Patreon, we usually release these, and you're still able to purchase the CEs for the 2 CEs if you would so be inclined. But because many of you may not know us, for our book clubs, we like to release a little preview, so to get a taste of what some of our discussion of the book is like. And so this summer, we are reading Walden Two by B.F. Skinner. We said a lot about the book. We had a lot of mixed feelings about it. I learned a lot just from reading it and then talking about it with everyone here. So I hope you get a chance to do the same. And again, if you really like it, feel free to get the rest of that immediately by going to patreon.com/ABA Inside Track and subscribing at the $10 level. Otherwise, you can wait for it. It'll eventually come out in the free feed. But anyway, here is a preview of our Walden 2 discussion. Enjoy. Hey, everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track Summer 2023 Book Club. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous book buddies.
Hey, Rob. It's me, Diana.
And it's me, your furry pal, Jackie.
And it's me, your non-musical pal, Alan.
Alan, you're like the Bert to me, but not in the Bert and Ernie sense. You're just Bert, and I'm Grover.
Hey, Bert.
Okay, just different Muppets.
Yeah, in the 70s, I listened to a record, and Bert was in the bathtub for the entire time. Ernie just invaded his bath space.
Oh, I love that.
Do you remember that one?
It's like a theater of the mind kind of.
Yeah, he walked in, and he's like, I'm in the bathtub, Ernie. And I love that he just theoretically was naked the entire time that, like, the Michigan University marching band came into their bathroom.
Okay. So that's for
I'm definitely the Ernie to Rob's Bert, I would say.
Yeah. What, really? I'm not the Ernie?
I'm the messy one.
Well, you're messy. That's true. What?
You collect a lot of things.
I collect like paper clips and whatnot. Anyway, this is our, as I said at the top, our summer 2023 book club for patrons. So if you're hearing this and you're not a patron, it's far in the future. And we already recorded this and we're doing a different book at this point. But you can still enjoy
utopia in 2024.
Yeah, you can still enjoy what we thought about our book a year ago. Still have fun with that. But if you are a patron and you're listening to this in the year 2023, we thank you so very much for doing so. We are going to talk about a book that was voted on by listeners, and that is B.F. Skinner's Walden Two. This was originally was supposed to be fun books that we'll enjoy, and maybe that Diana already read, so she could get the summer off a little bit. And then the listeners chose the one book she had not read from the list.
But the book I read.
But Jackie had read it.
Yeah, it worked out for Jackie.
I read it multiple times.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking all about Walden 2. And why don't we just start with that? So who had read this book before this book club assignment?
I have read this book multiple times in various iterations of my life. This is one of the books that I read before I got into behavior analysis. And I think vastly differently about it now than I did then. And then I usually keep it by my bedside along with The Science of Human Behavior and read them when I'm trying to fall asleep at night if I can't fall asleep after my regular book, because it usually only takes 1 or 2 pages.
Ouch. Take that, B.F. Skinner.
But if you are one thing I noticed again while like looking through the book this time is if you have read a lot of B.F. Skinner, his writing doesn't change from the literary B.F. Skinner to the scientific B.F. Skinner. And I think that's a downfall of the book.
Well, as a piece of fiction.
Of literature, right? But I do have another thing that I want to say later about it.
Okay. Well, we got about 2 hours.
Good.
So
you'll have a chance to do so.
And Alan, how about you? I had not read this book before this. Had you read it before?
I definitely had read parts of it. I think back when I was in college, like a long time ago, before I knew I was even going to enter this field. because I found parts of it familiar, and then I realized I had read a section of this and then a section of Kuhlman's like Living Walden Two, which is like 2000. By the time I was in college, so it was a big deal. Like sort of investigation, examination of that, and they even mentioned the Skinnerian little like utopia commune in Mexico and everything. So
Comunidades Los Horcones.
Yeah. So I definitely had found parts of it. I was like, oh yeah, I definitely have read this. But reading it all the way through, this was definitely my first time.
All right.
I much prefer his later work after some people have basically told him to stick to science, and then he's kind of like defeated and refined and sticks to a more like philosophical and psychological lens, because this is kind of a lot to slog through.
All right.
So we all know I hadn't read it.
We all know Diana had not read. Her plan backfired, and she had to read a different book. But hopefully she enjoyed it. We'll find out, won't we? So we're going to start kind of by talking a little bit about the book, some of the context of when it was written, some initial thoughts, and then in the back half we'll get into more of the more detailed sort of review and our own sort of analysis here. So there were a couple other pieces that I thought were interesting. Alan, you mentioned the Kuhlman Living Walden 2 book, which I did not read. I read an article. I don't remember where I got the article. It was sort of like a review of Living Walden 2, as I did not have time to read Living Walden 2, plus this book, plus everything else. So, but that did seem like a very interesting review of sort of what real life Walden 2-esque communities had come up. I think there were two big ones that sort of came up in the 70s. Then there were two other pieces that I thought were really interesting. I don't know if anyone kind of like caught these, if they were doing any like Google searches, but there was a really good behavior analyst article from 2009 by Altus and Morris, B.F. Skinner's Utopian Vision Behind and Beyond Walden 2, which I know I took a couple notes from just in terms of its doing a lot of, I think, what we were planning to talk about, which is this book was written so long ago, way before, ADA, and what does it mean, if anything, to modern behavior analysts, most of whom are practicing within the applied field. And I thought that book was really good. So I'll try to mention when I have ideas that sound really great that I kind of just were like, they was in this article. So rather than everyone thinking it was my good idea, it wasn't. It was theirs. And I also found a really great New York Times article from March 15th, 1970 by Richard Todd called Walden 2, 3, Many More, which was just a great review of where Walden 2 sat at the time. So 50 years ago now, it's a long time ago, but it had a lot of quotes and interview with B.F. Skinner that added a lot of extra context. That was just really, really fascinating. And then it also looked a little bit at the types of communities that were trying to do Walden 2s and really sort of reflecting on, I think, a lot of the malaise that was going on in the 70s that honestly, and your context will vary. I think a lot of the same malaise that was going on in the 70s does feel like it's permeating some of what's going on, at least American culture these days. It's not exactly a one-to-one correspondence, but a lot of sense of just things aren't right, and we're not quite sure what to do about some of those things. And again, I think your mileage will vary in terms of how you feel about that. But I think this is a really good time, at least for me personally, it was a really good time to be reading Walden 2, because I am going through my own sort of crisis of what's going on in life, and am I happy about how things are going in, personal life, in real life. Mostly personal life is fine, but like in the general way things are going, I think, in society, and a lot of those things are really making me personally think there's got to be a better way almost every day. And it was really interesting reading Walden 2 with that mindset. I don't think I would have enjoyed this book at all had I read it maybe in like my 20s or early 30s, but I found myself really liking it this time, at this point in my life, not this time through, because it was the first time I had read it. So why don't we just start real quick with Around the Horn, like your first thoughts on the book, then we'll talk a little bit about how it was written and go on. So in general, Jag, I know you really love this book, but you have some qualms with it each time you read it, or your qualms change over time?
Yeah, so overall, I like the idea of the book.
Mhm.
I like the idea that everyone can be taken care of in their own way and how they all see fit. I don't see how that could actually happen in real life, but I like the ideal, and everyone can come as they are, and be part of a community. I like the idea of communal living. I think I would really jazz a communal living situation, right, with my own room.
You could do. I think I could see you being in a communal living space, and then you get your own private space. Sometimes, most of the time, you're doing and sharing. I could see you really enjoying
I think I'd really love it. I have a friend that lives in Boston that lives in a communal living house where they have their own bedrooms and bathrooms, but the living room and all the kitchen is all shared space. Mm-hmm. And I always like going to visit her. You have to really like the people that you're in there with, though, right? Because then obviously it turns horrible. But
and they're not products of Walden Two's social engineering. So
no, so it's just the communal living. I think I really like that aspect. I like the aspect of changing your career often. Mm-hmm. If you depending on the season, changing what you do for work. I kind of like that idea, and that's one of the things that appealed to me about Walden Two. It's I could be a professor in the fall, but in the winter, I could shift my focus and do more inward work.
Jackie, they're not going to give you any credits for being a professor. This is a pretty anti-professor book.
You're right.
You at best might be able to get the stage for an hour lecture just to entertain the folks.
Multiple times, though.
Right? As many times as you want to.
As many times I want to. So I like that idea because I think a lot of people get into a job and then they have to stay in that job even if they don't like it because they're living paycheck to paycheck. So I like that idea of being able to move more seamlessly through jobs, although I don't know how that would work, right? When you think about it, I'm not sure how that would work seamlessly. And when we get to the childcare portion, I do not like that one.
That one will bring that one up. That
was a huge, big red flag for me. And the construct of female and male and child rearing and birthing. Women could start having kids at 16 if they want to. Not really quite into that, but we'll get there. And how that part of the book I found fascinating. And I'm wondering, here's what I want to think. I'm wondering when Skinner wrote this book, if he is both Frasier and Burrus.
Yes.
Right? I love that.
Yes, he is. And he mentioned actually in the Times piece that he wrote it as sort of a self-therapy.
Oh,
so
man.
He is both characters.
Because I could see the Frasier guy. I didn't even know that.
Well,
I didn't even read
thank you, Richard Todd.
Didn't even read the Times piece. But that's what when I read it, I was like, oh, I can see Skinner in the Frasier. That is how he is.
Yeah.
Scientifically, right? Boring, flat.
A jerk
in a way, but he doesn't really mean to be a jerk. He's just scientifically minded and not unempathetic.
He's not checking his privilege, that's for sure.
That is definitely true.
Definitely true.
Yeah, definitely not checking his privilege.
All right.
Alan,
anyway. What about you? Kind of an initial, overall, general summary of feelings about the book.
Well, I just want to make sure I read the 76 when he revisited it.
Yes.
And did the update just to make sure.
We all did.
Yeah, we all did.
Good call, Alan. Yes, you should be reading. If you are reading an original copy of Walden 2, put it down, put it on your shelf. That's a collector's item. Go buy the revisited one, which is just you could get as a fancy paperback, or
it's
Diana
only 50
has.
Years old. The reissue.
The reissue is only 50 years old, but you can get them updated printings. But you can get the one Diana has, which is actually from the local high school library of my hometown.
Rejected, apparently.
Framingham, Mass. And they threw it out, and now it's in Diana's library.
Never checked out.
No one checked it out.
No one ever checked this book out. I have the library card. It is blank.
Or it was so checked out that they kept having to put new ones in, and they finally stopped because they switched to digital.
Maybe that's it.
Well, no, so I just like to do that because his preface where he talks about rewriting it and is kind of looking back 30 years later is helpful, I think.
Agree.
Yes.
And understanding his mindset, because it's also, I don't think he distances himself from it exactly, but he definitely puts a little, this was me 30 years ago, and I've been educated in that time. So I think that definitely helps with the revulsion I feel for a lot of the actual content. When it comes
we're behavior analysts, so we should allow anyone to grow and change.
Yeah, exactly. And I wasn't sure when we were going to talk about the historical context, which I can refrain from that at the moment. But I just thinking about when this was written, just some of the highlights that are important, like Piaget, Erickson, coming from special ed, like bigger names in like education theory, child development, like they're writing at the same time. Like he's writing kind of in the dark about a lot of things, probably. Like there aren't like sort of, you have to acknowledge this stuff. This is a big conversation, especially 1945 when he's writing this. And then thinking about, it's interesting. He has a bit of a like anarcho-communist bent in some of his idealism. So I think it's interesting. He doesn't ever say from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, that kind of thing. But definitely has that vibe. But I think it's interesting because he does kind of have we're a blank slate approach to human development. But again, like genetics doesn't really exist at this point. Like people haven't really rediscovered Mendel's works when he's writing this. Right. So like biology and our understanding of like just how organisms grow just isn't there.
Eugenics was in existence.
Yes.
Yeah, eugenics definitely was. But I should say modern concepts of like the genome and everything just isn't there. Definitely has the eugenics vibes, especially that I think that's why the child development portion is so
gross,
sketchy,
horrible.
And gross, horrible is because it does seem very eugenicsy of just like, well, let's make sure people don't raise their own children. That's kind of gross. So and again, I say these things not to sort of forgive him, but to say he really was like in the dark about what a lot of things that we take to be good and established, or at least worth addressing as modern behaviorists. So, but
it's also a book of fiction.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
It is, but it's a philosophical work. Like I don't know, I think people love Plato's Republic, but it's a horrible fascistic system, and his system does not improve upon that in any way. It's just a little more behaviorist. So I'm not a huge fan of this based on the sum of my background. Plus, just thinking about like he has very gendered roles,
gendered roles,
which again for the time. That wasn't, I guess, in the conversation, but I think it actually was. It wasn't him being intransigent on it. It was just him just being like, oh, well, this is just how it is and kind of how it ought to be. So we just don't have a great distinction of a lot of things. So like, I don't think this is good representation of Skinner like ideas. I think it's good to go back and reread it and be like, okay, this is what's problematic about Skinner, and anything I don't appreciate about verbal behavior and the science of human behavior, this can help inform your reading of those, but not my favorite book.
And Dan, I think you had kind of a similar vibe from it than Alan did, I think, as you're kind of mentioning the other day.
Yeah, of course, Alan is able to word these things much more clearly than I am.
You were just going to do 1 star, arrived damaged in box.
I shared a lot of the same concerns that Alan did. The book feels very, to me, old and outdated, but also, I don't know, like I had a hard time, even if I were to try to say like, let's use this. Let's say we like it and we want to use it as a roadmap for creating a society. I couldn't tell what to do.
No, I couldn't tell what to do either. Yeah, right. If you're going to use this as like a treatment plan, it's not helpful.
I really couldn't understand. No. And then I was like so caught up the whole time in understanding the psychology behind Frasier and the complexities of the relationships between these 3 men. And I spent a lot of time on that and on my own like Jackie and I are English majors as background, so a lot of reflection on just the structure of this book and how it's not really that great as a novel. And I don't know, I just went around in circles in my own head quite a bit, and I did not find it a convincing display of utopia. Like, I didn't want to join Walden Two at the end of it. I do only want to do 4 hours of work a day, though.
Same.
So
okay, all right. Well, let's talk a little context of when the book was written, because I think, as we all brought up, while there are some interesting ideas here, the fact that it is such an old book, and even Skinner's Walden Two Revisited piece at the beginning is such an old piece of writing now, there's a lot of additional context. So, Alan, I have some here. I know you've always got like your finger on the pulse. No matter the decade we're talking about, you always have a good sense of what's going on.
Yeah.
So please jump in anywhere. But some of the key pieces about when did Skinner write this? So at this time, he was a professor. He was about to start working at Indiana University or University of Indiana. And he had one child who just finished her first year of school. And it was the end of World War II. He'd written a book, The Behavior of Organisms. That's it. And then when we think about it, I know I started reading this book thinking there's going to be so many behavior analytic ideas. And really, spoiler alert, the main idea that you would say as a behavior analyst, I see it, is use of positive reinforcement versus aversives. And there are some other smaller ones or ones
presented
that
in chapter 29 out of 33.
Yeah, the first time you will see the term positive reinforcement is at the end of the book, pretty much. So it's not a book in the sense of it's not an ABA primer in anything, because there was only so much research on human behavior and sort of with that behaviorist lens at the time. So he was at a dinner, and a lot of this is from the Times piece, some of it from his Revisited. He was at a dinner, he was talking with someone, World War II was ending and the soldiers are coming back. And he was talking with a lady about, what should they do when they get back? And this is from, I believe this is from his Revisited, or the Times piece, I believe. What a shame, he said, that they would abandon their crusading spirit and come back only to fall into the old lockstep American life, getting a job, marrying, renting an apartment, making a down payment on a car, having a child or two. When asked what they should do instead, he answered, they should experiment. They should explore new ways of living, as people had done in the communities of the 19th century. So there's a lot of sort of Shakerism, which was a kind of a movement, or some of the moving back to the land movements of the kind of the 1800s. If you come visit Massachusetts, we have lots of old kind of communities that had some kind of Walden Two pieces to them. And from that idea, he said, I'm going to write a book. I got some time before my new job. And in 7 weeks, he wrote a book originally going to be called The Sun is But a Morning Star, which is the end of Henry David Thoreau's Walden. If you were expecting a sequel to see what happened to Henry David Thoreau, this is not that book. That doesn't come up. Thoreau is mentioned, but it's not the continuing adventures of Henry David Thoreau.
I heard that Thoreau's mom still did his laundry while he was living in the cabin in the woods.
I mean, that does not.
Because he's a man. He's a man.
I'm not surprised he doesn't have a washer and dryer, and he can't use
Walden Pond. Even back then.
I mean, he doesn't want to do that.
Saying.
He's too busy
wandering around.
Too busy.
And then they pointed
around.
out in this book too that was just an experiment of one man, not a community.
Yes. So the book took a while to get published. It was published. It was written in 1945.
A badly written book.
And it was published in 1948 and received mixed reviews.
Yeah,
the New York Times review said it was alluring in a sinister way and appalling too.
Do you feel bad for Skinner because all he wanted to do was be a writer and he's not really good at writing?
I don't feel bad for Skinner.
No, I think things all worked out for him in the end.
He's okay. You don't know until you try.
I mean, he's a bad writer, but he's one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century.
But that's not what he wanted to be.
So he'd go home and he'd be after a standing ovation lecture at a conference, he'd just go home and just sit in his bed and just cry himself to sleep.
You don't know.
Perhaps my pigeons like my books.
He only did that to make a paycheck. He's like, I'm interested in this, but my heart's passion.
I'm the next Hemingway.
He never fulfilled his heart's passion.
Oh, we don't know that necessarily for sure.
I'm besties with him. I talked to him beyond the grave.
Oh, okay. Seance that?
Yeah. Just kidding.
So the book really was not a huge seller. It did eventually, as of the 70s, so in the New York Times article, he had a graph of sales that he kept in his office, at least at the time, the author said.
See, that's sad.
And it did begin selling more and more. And as of when I started doing my notes for this episode, June 29th, 23rd, this is the number 21st book on in behaviorism psychology on Amazon, and it's the 95,896 books in all of Amazon's listings of books sold.
That's not bad.
Still in print.
So still in print.
Yeah.
I also spent about 30 minutes trying to figure out, how do you find out how much a book is sold? And the answer is, it's very hard, and it's
kind of
not
like knowing how many podcasts downloads.
they don't make it easy for you, that's for sure.
Well, I don't know at the time, but I did have an article that I pulled up that, like no one read this book until the 60s.
Yeah.
And then it was 79, he finally hit the 2 million mark. So no one was reading this at the time, except his fellow psychologists probably, to be like, stop writing, Skinner.
Oh, yeah.
So it had very little impact at the time. It was much later. I think that's why the Times piece was written in the 70s, because it was another time of change in history. So everyone finished World War II. And I mean, I understand why. If I came home from World War II and all of a sudden there's jobs and everyone can move to the suburb and I'm a white man, I probably would not want to change the way things were too much, because a lot of people were able to have stuff in a way they hadn't been able to have before. Not all people, certainly, but a lot of folks. Whereas I think at the end of the 60s, 70s, you're seeing a lot of the rejection of the mainstream culture. So something like a Walden Two would be more appealing to some people. And there have been some Walden Twos. And Alan, you mentioned Kuhlman's Living Walden Two book as sort of a follow-up of what those communities were like. The only two real communities that I saw mentioned over and over again, there's one in Twin Oaks.
Not anymore, though.
It's gone now. And they actually visited Twin Oaks at the time of when the New York Times piece was written. They went and visited. And the big takeaway was, these people are living in poverty. They're living in this very, very, very sort of, rundown area. And it didn't seem sustainable.
Yeah.
Whereas Comunidades Los Halcones, which stands is the Community of the Bifurcated Pillars, was founded in 1973 and is still around. Though I think Kuhlman mentioned that there was a lot more religion sort of supporting some of the people who live there. So not exactly what you get in Walden 2, where religion was not necessarily outlawed, but was not really expected to be something that a Walden 2 community would care about for any length of time. However, part of the book is about experimenting and seeing what works. So at least for that community, having a religious background and religious faith is a component of their community. So, I think Skinner was really happy that people were starting to read his books, though he did mention in the New York Times piece that this is not meant to be what is the quote? It was a really good one. It's not meant to be a handbook for hippies, is not the purpose of Walden 2. But I think he does see Walden 2, and I think he mentions this in Walden 2 Revisited. He does see a lot of the same ideas or some of the key components of Walden 2 as being still relevant. And I kind of want to, I know we talked about some specifics in the book that felt wrong-headed or felt very of their time in a bad way, but when it comes to some of the components, are there pieces in Walden 2 that we all might agree, this probably should be something that we're thinking about in our communities more than others? For me, I loved the sections talking about politics and the idea that who runs for office, people who need to have answers, and they will make their answers come about based on power, and how we need more just experimentation and that spirit of what will work and how do we know it worked, and then we have to try it and then implement something and make effective change for our communities, rather than just counting on any one person to be in charge. I think they talk a lot about how democracy is not so much about everyone gets a vote, so much as everybody gets a vote, but they don't have any power. It's just nice that they get a vote, because the people in power can then blame them for voting for all the things that have gone wrong when they really had no say in it. And I think in a lot of our political systems now, I find that idea of we need not leaders, but we need communities that are interested in the benefit of the community as a whole. I think that is an important component of government that I see getting left out a lot. I mean, I don't follow politics as much as I used to, because it is frustrating, but something like that. Some of those themes I think still would be resonant. I would find them still to be useful. But some of the other pieces, I think we'll talk about how they're not ones that any of us would be happy about, and most people probably would agree.
It did feel, when you're reading the book, a little culty.
Mm-hmm.
Like, especially when they're talking about women's dress, and they're like, we're not quite trendy,
mm-hmm.
but we're not trendy, right? And it's like, we use timeless things, but then we wear our hair a certain way. And they're like, well, what if somebody wants to come messy? Can they come say, oh, well, I should think not. Right? When he writes back, like, well, what if somebody wants to come to lunch and they haven't showered? Well,
these things just wouldn't happen.
They just wouldn't happen. Like, that part is weird for me, because obviously it would happen. Right? I hate showering.
Not if they were properly behaviorally engineered.
Yes.
Because
but that's creepy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. Mm-hmm. Especially the way he puts it. On the other hand, if we took about it from the idea of like, people who do that, some people just do it out of choice. But if people are needs are being met, how often is that going to happen? I think is the flip side.
Right.
He just is not a good writer.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Like, and similar with the dress, I think he's trying to sort of not engage in the modesty versus fashion debate.
Right. Yes.
And just by saying, oh, well, we have trends, we're not the trendiest, and I don't want to talk anymore about this.
Okay. Yeah. Right.
He didn't want to write the cool internet piece of like, what are the 10 pieces of clothing that never go out of style?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, they all sweater vests. I think.
Sweaters, blouses.
I think when you get one of those jackets that have the leather arm pads, like a real professor, those are always in style, I believe.
That's funny. But yeah, and then when he also tried to bring up like when to have sex debate, right? Like very quickly, like
I thought this was a pretty sex positive book.
I mean.
Oh, yeah?
I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm from Puritan New England.
Sure.
The fact that they put the word sex in it makes it a sex-positive book as far as my education tells me.
It was, but it was in the context of saying we're going to have our teenagers get married and start families.
Mm-hmm.
No, not get married. They didn't have to get married. They just had to start having babies.
And you could have sex outside of wedlock, and it wasn't like, you can't. It was like...
There's no bastardy.
Yeah.
They said that.
Do you know why? Because nobody got married. So that was the thing, right?
They got married.
They got married, but they didn't have to at 16. So at 16, you have the kids. But of course, your tastes are going to change. And so you get married when you're an adult after having 5 kids by 22 years old, right? And then your whole world's open up because you actually don't have to take care of the kids, which also is creepy.
Yeah.
I do like the book, but there are creepy parts, right?
I don't know, and it ties into the politics too, is, they're saying like, we don't have a democracy because we should just trust the people who designed the place, that everything's going to work out correctly because, we've removed all of these, basically the problematic elements of the human condition, right? Which we've done through behavioral engineering. So no one's going to feel jealousy or envy or anger anymore.
Ever. But on the flip side, when he asked, are you happy? That woman's like, I haven't thought if I was happy. Remember that part?
Right.
And she's like, I haven't had to think about my feelings, which also is problematic.
It's a huge suspension of disbelief to me that one could create a system in which none of these things exist anymore, and that even without democratization, we would have leadership that actually protects the goodwill and safety of its members, because every other situation in history, and I know they say don't listen to history, every other situation in history, powerful people become corrupt.
I think when we talk about some of the themes, I definitely hear in many of the critiques and the concerns that, very valid points, but some of it is, and I think it comes through a lot more in the Walden Two kind of revisited essay than in Walden Two itself, that we shouldn't be reading, no one should read Walden Two and say, aha, I'll do what they did here, and this will make an amazing community. It's more, I think, the themes. I think the themes are what spoke to me. The idea of why do we consume so much, at least in America? Why, and in a lot of places, like, why do we consume? Why is everything so important? And what happens if we just did more with less? And not in a leisure class has the most and everyone else should just deal with it. But like, what if we just
It's about efficiency.
what if we were thinking about efficiency? What if we were thinking about, so when we talked about, say, like clothes, when we first started talking, that idea of, well, the trends don't change. I think, Alan, you were maybe getting at this a little bit, that idea of it's not about the fact that fashion doesn't exist or fashion doesn't change. It's just, what if everyone grew up being like, yep, I have clothes and I like these clothes and they're useful clothes, and that's as far as it went. And how do you engineer that? I don't know. I don't really love how it's in the book, but that idea sounds interesting to pursue. Like, what if we didn't have to just keep generating new clothes for every season because there's a financial motivation to get new trends out? Like, would we be happier overall? Would that be better for the environment?
On the flip side of that, I would say that, and I think this speaks to what sort of Jackie talked about, like it feeling culty, is like fashion and self-expression. We tie those things together. And so if someone doesn't want to like dress like everybody else, like, you know, people now, even now, like people go through a huge part of their expendable income to like make things like cosplay and to like dress a certain way because they want to. Part of that is like a response to some of the more like oppressive and exclusionary parts of our culture. But I mean, I think that is a basic human drive to want to like be comfortable in how you dress. Again, I think the problematic nature comes from he's assuming that if everyone's needs are met, you don't have to think about those things. Mm-hmm. And he just goes from there.
And that you won't care to.
Right, yeah. Because you won't need to.
Well, some of it too, and we can, you know, we'll get into this more when we talk about like individual sections, but a lot of the, well, I guess we're at the part where we're talking about kind of the book as a book, right? As a written book. A lot of the sort of assumptions made when this book were written, it did have a sense of, we want to have less work and we want the work to be meaningful. And then people have time for their own pursuits. And I feel like Skinner in Revisited, if you asked him something like, what about fashion? What about people whose passion was dress and clothing, would probably speak of, well, that would be just like any other leisure pursuit, or that would be like any other scientific or artistic pursuit. However, when the book was written, it does sort of feel like the only leisure activity Skinner could think of is like, well, what do people do for leisure and art? Well, they play instruments and they're in an orchestra, right? That's what everybody wants to use their free time for, or they paint, or they garden. Like, that's it. The three leisure activities.
Yeah. Gardening's not that hard, so you only get 1 credit of work for that.
Oh, because everyone loves gardening. You would have to give me all my work credits to get out in the garden for an hour.
Like, so many people want to do that,
So we hope you enjoyed our preview of our Summer Book Club 2023 discussion of Walden 2. If you can't wait and want to hear how the rest of our 2-hour-ish length podcast went and what other things we talked about in the book, just head right on over to patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. There's a link in your podcast player, and you can subscribe at the $10 or up level to get access to that right now, as well as to all of the previous book clubs we've done. That also will get you access to a special code word that you can enter when you go to purchase CEs to get those CEs at no additional charge. Again, that's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. We hope to see you there. Otherwise, we will see you at our next book club. But until then, keep responding. Bye.